Hey guys, what is up? Welcome to 2020. It's obviously been some time since I've made a video. Over the past few months, I've had ideas that I've been kicking around where I can make videos, and ultimately for each idea I decided it was really too limited, too short to do anything meaningful with it. And then one day I realized that I had a number of these ideas that I had assembled over time, and I thought, well, it might be cool to do either a video or maybe even a series of videos on a collection of these ideas. So most of these are things related to getting good, to improving at the game, and they really run the gamut. Some of them are for beginners. Some of them are going to apply to more advanced players. I'm sure a lot of you will know a lot of these. Some of you may know all of them, but I'm really hoping that there'll be something here for everyone to provoke some thought, something that maybe you don't do as well as you could, an area of improvement. So with that in mind, let's go. So I think my first tip would be, don't be predictable. It's all too easy to fall into predictable patterns, and it's actually really difficult to be really unpredictable. And it's one thing I definitely notice when I play really good players. They're very difficult to predict. They have a much easier time predicting me. I've gotten a lot better at it, but I'm still a fairly predictable player. And I was thinking about this as I was watching Hayes play in one of his recent videos, and I know from playing against him, he is probably one of the least predictable players I've ever confronted. He's got such great mix-ups, especially when he's playing with his Dragon Slayer axe and S-Stock. Just really a force to be reckoned with. Definitely recommend watching players like that and trying to learn something from them about how they carefully mix up their attacks and they make it so that they aren't very predictable. And of course, it helps that he gets really good reads. He's able to predict his opponents, and so he's able to tailor his mix-ups to how they play. I could probably make an entire video about this one topic, and maybe I will, but for now, it will have to suffice there. So I haven't quite figured out why this one is true, but it definitely is. The players that you've seen on YouTube or maybe you've seen on Twitch, they're probably a lot better than you think, especially if you've never played against them. If your only experience with a player is watching them play on YouTube or Twitch, they're probably a lot better than you think. And I'm not really sure why this is the case, but it's happened to me over and over and over again where I've seen somebody play, I've had a certain assessment of their skill, I go and I fight against them, and they're way better than I thought. Again, not really sure why this is the case, but I thought it was really interesting, and so I thought I'd share it with you guys. Of all the tips that I have, or the insights, this is probably the most important one. This is something I see players doing all the time, and if you are one of these players, I highly recommend you change your approach. And this is players that are auto resetting to neutral after 2 hits, and this is something that I used to do all the time. I'd get somebody with a straight sword, hit them twice, and then reset to neutral. Bonus negative points if you're rolling out afterwards. Any sort of neutral reset is a bad idea, but it's doubly bad when you achieve it via a roll. You completely eliminate any pressure that you had. You really had a great opportunity to go for mix-ups, continue the pressure. This was probably the single thing that I learned that improved my gameplay the most. I would say, again, if you watch the really good players, this is one of the things that definitely separates. It's kind of like, you know, that intermediate to expert. It's one of those sort of key skill differentiators. Make sure you don't relinquish pressure. Now, of course, if you're fighting multiple opponents, sometimes you're going to have to break just because you have to have a look around and make sure that people aren't creeping up on your flanks. That's totally understandable, and you should definitely keep doing that. But that should be the reason you break pressure. You shouldn't do it reflexively. I definitely really encourage players to examine their own gameplay. And if you're doing this, if you're just automatically resetting to neutral, you should definitely stop doing that. So related to resetting to neutral, another mistake I see players make, and I used to make a lot, is automatically double rolling. This is something that a lot of us learned as duelists. You're fighting somebody with a straight sword, and you roll the first attack and then get roll caught on the second, which unfortunately sometimes will happen even if you do roll a second time. And I'm not suggesting you should never double roll. Sometimes it's appropriate, but as your spacing improves, you should learn when you need to double roll and when you don't. And if you don't have to, don't. Because rolling once can put you in a great position to whiff punish somebody and keep pressure going on somebody, and it can really put them on their back foot. So don't reflexively double roll. Roll once and evaluate. If you need that second roll, go ahead, but don't do it unless you absolutely have to. Next up is around weapon selection. I don't necessarily have the position that you should always seek to hard counter your opponent by finding a weapon that hard counters their selection, though it can sometimes be a good idea. And I think this is a point that G9 used to emphasize with me over and over. The more closely matched you are in skill to the other player, the more the matchup matters. And when you're really closely matched, the matchup becomes essentially everything. So even though you may not necessarily look to hard counter your opponent, you should definitely make sure that they don't hard counter you, especially if you're close at all in terms of skill. The other thing, which is related to weapon swapping, is around hard swapping in general. And it could be hard swapping weapons in the middle of a fight. It could be hard swapping even in the middle of a combo. It could be a ring swap. I assume a lot of you saw Mocha's recent video about the kill switch, swapping to Gundyrs. I know that's something that G9's been doing for quite a while. And I can tell you from fighting players that will hard swap at a moment's notice, it's very intimidating because you never really know what's coming next. And I will tell you also that the more I've integrated hard swapping into my own gameplay, it's gotten me to be a much better player. It's still a work in progress. It's still something I'm really not very good at, but I have a huge incentive to improve because as I add little bits of hard swapping into my gameplay, I immediately see returns in my win-loss record. So with respect to weapons, if you've never ever mained a curved sword, and by this I don't just mean simply that you've used one, I mean mained it and gotten to know it. If you've never done that, you really should. I had an interesting discussion with a number of really good players, and we had all independently come to the exact same conclusion, which is that playing curved sword is what really unlocked the game for a lot of us. It really taught us a lot about getting good reads, about being able to punish opponents. The curved sword in some sense is like the ultimate lever. It's the ultimate skill lever. You know, a curved sword in the hands of an average player is really not much of a threat. It's really no more of a threat than a straight sword is in my view. In fact, straight sword might actually be worse because of the range. Curved sword really becomes dangerous in the hands of somebody who's good, and the better a player they are, the more dangerous that curved sword becomes. If you learn how to play well with a curved sword, it will teach you a lot about the game. And in fact, if you then go on maybe to use offhand hand axe, S-stock rapier, whatever it may be, you essentially play that weapon the same way you play with a curved sword. Use it to pressure, use it to roll catch. I just cannot emphasize enough how much this will improve you as a player. I know a lot of players, and myself included, shied away from curved sword for a long time just because it has a reputation of being a super try-hard weapon, and it certainly can be that. But even if it's just using something like the Gru curved sword, which admittedly doesn't have much of a reach, if you start playing with that weapon, you will quickly realize how much better you can be with it. You can get reads on your opponent, you can roll catch, you can interrupt. There's so many things that you can do. Definitely give those weapons a try. Don't shy away from doing things just because noobs tend to do them. I see this way too often, and it used to be something that I fell into, a trap I fell into, which is I wouldn't do things that I thought noobs would do. And I'm thinking of things like rolling attacks, spamming R1, attacking out of hit stun, all these sorts of things. They're typical noob markers, and so for a lot of us, we don't want to do them because it can make us look like noobs. In fact, there's a comment on one of my videos. It was a video about cheating, and somebody left a comment and they said the only thing worse than a cheater is somebody who spams R1 with a straight sword. And I think they were serious, and it kind of made me laugh. If you're doing those things because you're new, well, then you should learn and get better. But you shouldn't abandon those things entirely. Spamming R1 with a straight sword can be extraordinarily effective, especially against good players, because they're usually expecting you to stop after a second R1 or maybe go for an R2, and they're going to look and reaction roll it. And if you see a player doing that, just spam away. Good players with hyper armor weapons will look for things like that, and they'll try to punish you by attacking out of stun, and they'll interrupt your R2. But if you keep swinging, you're going to interrupt them before they can get into their hyper armor. It's just a great mix-up. It's a great way to keep people on their toes. I think Mocha described it as opponent conditioning. I think that's a great way of looking at it. That's specific to R1 spamming. Rolling attacks can be really great, especially if somebody's pressuring you. It's a great way to break up pressure. If you don't do it often, people aren't going to know to parry you very often. Of course, against a true parry spammer, especially the type you find at low level, it might be a little dangerous to throw even one out, but otherwise you can feel confident throwing these out. And of course, you have to calibrate how often you do them based on what you think the risk is. Attacking out a hit stun is another one of these things. I used to never do it just because you learn early on that attacking out a hit stun is a good way to get parried. And that's true if you do it predictably, but if you do it every so often, it can be a great tool. And if you think the other player is going to try to parry you, you can mix up swinging a third time with trying to run to their back to get a backstab. That's a great way to condition your opponent as well. But in short, don't stay away from things that noobs do just because you don't want to appear to be a noob. There's nothing that screams that a player is really sophisticated when you know they're good at spacing, they're good at a lot of the game elements, and yet you'll see them mash R1 on a straight sword. That's a sure sign of somebody that's come very far in this game. So momentum. So I used to have arguments with Schwa, Akari, and Saint Riot about the existence of momentum. I used to not really think it was a thing. I've really changed my perspective on this. I think it's really important. And I want to talk a little bit about how and why I think it is important. Players, we tend to think of players as good or bad, and a player either maybe reaction rolls or they panic roll. But I think rather than thinking about players in such discrete ways, we should think about them along a continuum. And how they react and how they play is very much dependent on how you are playing against them. And as a simple example, I can tell you that I work really hard to try to reaction roll as often as possible, especially in a 1v1. I really don't panic roll too much. But if I'm playing against a really good player, especially like a good curved sword player, like maybe B-dubs, for example, I will start panic rolling left and right, even though I know going in that that's a risk. I know going in that that's a thing to focus on not doing. I will still do it just because of the extraordinary pressure he's able to bring to bear. So what I would say is understanding momentum is part of getting good reads. So one example that I like to use is if I'm playing with the offhand S-stock, I'm going to go for a lot of roll catches. And unless the latency is really low, a lot of times they're predictive roll catches. Well, predictive roll catches against somebody that has a parry shield can be really dangerous. And so I tend to keep them kind of to a minimum at first, or maybe I'll wait till they roll a couple times before I go for it. And I'm also pretty careful to avoid getting parried out of a roll by somebody that sees the roll catch coming. But what I found is even against players that will try to parry roll catches, once you start putting them under more and more pressure, they will stop trying to do that and they will just try to roll and get away. And then it becomes much safer to go for those roll catches. So I kind of think of players on a sort of seesaw. They're playing offensively or they're playing defensively. And most players can't do both at the same time. But being able to understand how the momentum of the fight is working and how aggressively you can play against another player, these are important facets of getting reads on other players. Okay guys, I'm going to end it there. I've got a lot more of these, certainly enough for another video, maybe enough for 2 more videos. I would also encourage anyone out there, if you've got ideas that you think should be shared more broadly, please leave a comment, let me know. One of the great things about having a YouTube channel is all the great feedback that I get from everybody, and it's helped me learn so much, and it would be awesome if I could share some of those tips with everyone else. So please do leave those comments. I'm really excited for 2020. I'm still having fun playing Dark Souls. I'm hoping a new game is coming soon. I'm a little disappointed that we haven't heard any update, but I expect that we'll hear something soon. So hang in there.